This lesson will introduce, describe, and provide examples of whole interval recording and momentary time sampling data collection methods. Like partial interval recording procedures, we begin whole interval recording procedures by structuring our recording sheet based on the length of our observation period, as well as the length of our time intervals. For example, if our team decides to use 5-minute time intervals and the observation period is 45 minutes, we want to ensure there are at least 9 boxes on our data recording sheet, so we have sufficient space to document the occurrence or non-occurrence of the target behavior throughout each specified time interval. Whole interval recording procedures can be used to monitor desired behaviors, such as class participation. The biggest difference between partial interval recording and whole interval recording procedures is that with the whole interval recording procedure, the behavior has to occur throughout the entire time interval for an X to go in the box. So let's say that our interval is 3 minutes long, and the behavior we're looking at is class participation. For example, participating in circle time. So we want the student to be participating in circle time activities throughout the entire 3-minute interval. If our student participates in circle time activities for the first 2 minutes and 30 seconds of the time interval, and then runs out of the classroom before the end of the time interval, we would not put an X in the box because our target behavior of class participation was not observed for the entirety of the time interval. Like partial interval recording, we typically summarize and report whole interval recording data as the percentage of intervals during which the target behavior was observed. For example, Cindy was observed participating during circle time throughout 10 of 15 intervals during our 45-minute observation period, or during 67% of our intervals observed. So as you might imagine, whole interval recording procedures can underestimate the actual time the behavior occurred. For example, we're looking at class participation. Our student is actively engaged in class activities for most of a time interval, and in the last 3 seconds they leave the assigned activity area or leave the classroom altogether. We would put an O in that box, and they would not be marked as engaging in the behavior for the whole interval. So it looks like they weren't participating at all, but really they were participating for most of the interval, just not the entire interval. So whole interval recording procedures can underestimate the actual time the behaviors occurred. Whole interval recording sheets documenting target behaviors, observed at or close to 0% of intervals observed, are unlikely to provide educators with the precise data needed to determine baseline rates of behavior prior to intervention implementation, as well as the effectiveness of behavioral interventions after implementation. Similar to partial interval recording procedures, shortening the time intervals can help capture more precise data through whole interval recording procedures, specifically if we find ourselves placing a hyphen or a zero in each time interval throughout the whole interval recording procedure, indicating our target behavior was not observed throughout the time intervals. Next, let's talk about momentary time sampling data collection. When collecting data using momentary time sampling procedures, we are not collecting data during intervals as we do with partial interval and whole interval recording methods. Instead, we are collecting data at the end of time intervals. For example, let's say we have 5-minute intervals. During these time intervals, we don't collect any data, and then once that 5-minute interval is up, we document whether or not the behavior is occurring at that exact moment in time. It doesn't matter if it was happening during the interval or if it lasted the entire interval, we are only looking at the end of the actual interval. An example behavior you can monitor using momentary time sampling procedures is cell phone use. You can have 1-minute time intervals, and at the end of each minute, look up. If the student is on their phone at that time, they get an X in the box, and if they're not on their phone, they get a 0 or an O in that box. During the actual interval, you're not collecting any data. Like partial interval and whole interval recording procedures, we typically summarize and report momentary time sampling data as the percentage of intervals during which the target behavior was observed. For example, Danny was observed using his cell phone at the end of 6 out of every 15 intervals during our 45-minute observation period, or at the end of 40% of intervals observed. Let's talk about advantages and disadvantages of momentary time sampling procedures within school-based contexts and situations. An advantage of momentary time sampling procedures is feasibility with regards to collecting data on multiple behaviors during the same observation period, or multiple students engaging in the same behavior. For example, let's say several of the students in your class are using their cell phones to text or access social media. You can say, okay, at the 1-minute mark, I'll collect Billy's cell phone behavior. At the 2-minute mark, Sally's cell phone behavior. At the 3-minute mark, Brian's cell phone behavior. And at the 4-minute mark, Andrew's cell phone behavior. And that allows you to potentially collect data on multiple students at the same time in a way that is fairly practitioner-friendly. A disadvantage associated with momentary time sampling procedures is that if a behavior doesn't last for very long, this type of data collection is unlikely to yield useful information. For example, imagine a student who would make hand gestures inappropriate for the school setting, like raising his middle finger in the direction of his peers. Because this behavior started and stopped within a couple of seconds, it was really easy to miss most occurrences of this problem behavior if collecting data using momentary time sampling procedures. For behaviors such as this one that don't last for very long, frequency and partial interval recording procedures are viable alternatives for collecting useful data.